Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday and welcome. I am Joyce Karam, Washington correspondent for the National, and on behalf of the Middle East Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, Protest Movements and Refugee Inclusion in Civil Society. Today's webinar is the third in a series on displacement during COVID-19, an initiative by MEI to highlight the perspectives and personal impacts faced by displaced people in the MENA region. Protests across the Middle East continue and have drawn global attention as they push against corruption and for political and economic reforms. Lebanon and Iraq in particular face economic crisis and many challenges relating to their refugees and IDP populations. These countries struggle today to provide basic needs like fresh water and electricity, and the refugee population faces, on top of the economic shortages, lack of public health access and discrimination. Today, we have an esteemed all-woman panel to discuss how these protests have affected displaced people and the possibility of integrating their unique challenges within the social movements. First, I would like to welcome Professor Sawsan Abdulrahim. Sawsan is, I think you would see her, I don't know how it would look on your Zoom, but she's, yeah, hi Sawsan. Sawsan is an associate professor of public health at the American University of Beirut. Her research focuses on social inequalities, health, and the structural conditions that influence the well-being of women, refugees, and labor migrants. We're very glad she's able to join us from Beirut. Next, we have Noof Assi. Hi, Noof. Noof is a gender-based violence specialist and co-founder of IQ Peace. She works with different international NGOs, some on the ground in Iraq. She is in Baghdad today, focusing on setting up high-quality emergency women's protection programs and humanitarian responses. Throughout this panel, I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A. You can all see on your screen, so please don't hesitate. At any point you want to pause a question to any of our panelists, you can do that. You can also do that by phone or if you're watching on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu, events@mei.edu. For technical issues, same email as well. Again, feel free to ask questions at any time during this panel. I will try to get to as many of them in the hour that we have. But to start this conversation, I'd like to turn it to our esteemed panelists, to Sawsan. I want to start with you. It's been heck of a month to be in Beirut in the aftermath of the most devastating blast in the country since the civil war. What is the situation like on the ground? What's the scope of the devastation, and how is it affecting the refugee population and those who are also displaced, hundreds of thousands, because of the blast itself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Joyce. And I'm very glad to be on this panel with Noof from Iraq as well. I also want to start by sending my condolences to the family and friends and Iraqi people for Reham Yaqub, who was an Iraqi activist who was recently killed, most likely in response to her role in agitating in Basra against a corrupt regime. I would speak very briefly and maybe just present some specific information later on in response to questions about the situation in Lebanon right now. As everyone knows, people in Lebanon are still reeling from the Beirut port explosion in terms of its impact. The impact is huge. The destruction is unbelievable. And the country is really devastated by the fact that a large part of Beirut has been destroyed. Around 300,000 people, I'm sorry, are homeless as we speak, continue to be homeless. The deaths, the numbers continue to rise until now. People are being lifted from underneath the rubble. I want to mention that more than 200 people have been killed, both Lebanese and non-Lebanese. The area around the Beirut port is cosmopolitan. It's mixed class. We generally hear more about Ashrafiyya and Jumeizah on the news, which are neighborhoods in downtown Beirut or close to downtown Beirut that are known for having like nice restaurants, nice old buildings. However, some of the other neighborhoods or areas around the port that have been devastated are actually working class neighborhoods where a lot of refugees and migrant workers lived and worked. The neighborhood of Karantina, for example, which is an industrial zone, is an area where a lot of refugees worked in basically low-skilled jobs, and also where they lived in dilapidated housing. So some of them have, lost family members and children, daughters, and wives in the blast. I want to mention that this explosion comes at a very difficult time for Lebanon. It comes after months, almost a year, of a total economic collapse, where even middle-class people, Lebanese citizens and middle-class people are basically suffering economically due to the devaluation of the local currency. So imagine refugees, imagine migrant workers who used to earn salaries of $100 or $200, who are now whose salaries now have been devalued by 60% or 70% because of the economic collapse. I want to go back to the explosion and just say that in the first couple of days after the explosion, of course, the country was reeling, people were numb and extremely angry. The names of the victims, not the martyrs, the names of the victims who have been killed or missing started to come out. A few days later, actually, it became apparent that the list of names that were publicized did not include the names of Syrian refugees or migrant workers who were killed. So, in fact, a separate list.
By the Lebanese authorities, you mean?
Right, by the Lebanese authorities or on the media. So, for example, we started out with a list of 50 names, and unfortunately, every day the list grew. Now we're close to 170 names of people who have been killed 2 weeks after. We know there are still a few people who are missing. But then a few days later, a separate list of around 41 to 43 names of Syrians came out. These names were not part of the original list of names of the victims. And also 4 Bangladeshi migrant workers were recovered early on. Other female migrant workers who lived in the Karantina area and in other areas, as well a few names of female workers who work in domestic service in Lebanon. The names of 2 Palestinian refugees also came out. So this was an unfortunate situation because at a time of grief and pain, still we saw 2 kinds of lists of names of victims, unfortunately. And I mean, currently there's been sort of like a turning point where the media.
Why do you think they were not these names of Syrian workers or labor migrants or that died in the Beirut explosion, why do you think their names were omitted from the official list initially?
I don't know the exact answer to this question. I can just say that it's very unfortunate that, as I was saying, that at this really time of grief and difficult moment in Lebanon, that it mattered whether the person was Lebanese or not Lebanese at that time. Things have changed, at least in the media. So the media started, covering or telling the stories of refugees who became victims from the explosion, also raising funds for Syrians who were injured and who needed surgeries in order to, people who lost their eye, people who were still in intensive care. So there was a turning point, and the media basically came back and started to mention the names and the stories of non-citizens. And also there was a program on Al Jadid TV that brought Palestinian members of the Palestinian civil defense who participated in the rescue operations and other migrant workers and told their stories on the news. I'm gonna stop here, and then I can, just because I feel I spoke for more than 3 minutes, but I can talk in more details about, particularly we can go back to the protests and the October 17 revolution and talk more about the participation of refugees and migrants in that event as well.
Thank you, Sawsan. We will for sure come back to you with more questions on that. To Noof Assi, who joins us from Baghdad. It's already been an extraordinary week for Iraq. The Prime Minister of Iraq is in Washington, and even while he was here, we saw protests continue across Iraq. We also saw, the killing of the murder, the assassination of two activists. One of them is a female activist, a Dr. Riham Yaqub. I know you work a lot on refugees and internally displaced people in Iraq, but if you can give us a layout of how is the situation in Baghdad today, what are the risks that an average protester or activist is taking today while being in Iraq?
First of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for Dr. Sawsan. My condolences as well as for what's happened in Lebanon and Beirut. The situation in Iraq is never been stable for since 2003 till the moment. We have ups and downs. The country itself, I can say, is after going through 3 wars, we never get a chance just to lick our wounds. We always go into a different kind of circumstances and new situations. Unfortunately, in each situation, we lose lots of people. The current situation is that since the 1st of October, protest and movement started in Iraq, let's say more in a different way. Through the years, through the past years, there were lots of movements, lots of protests requesting for infrastructure and basic needs. This time was a bit different because it was led by the youth, and there was an agreement not to have a specific leaders, because at one point we lost all the trust in all the leaders through the promises and through what's have been going on through the movements and the civil movements in Iraq. Since the 1st of October, the protesters have been facing harsh and live ammunition, using military weapons against the protesters who are 100% peaceful. There were no let's say violence against the army or the riot control forces. However, all these we were not able till the moment we have 700 persons who got killed through the protests. Not to mention more than 25,000 people like were injured, 5,000 of them were like into like going into like let's say damages like through like their lives, losing their abilities like to see or like to move or like being paralyzed. The situation currently, especially with the current visit, is that like Iraq is not able to control like the weapons. The government is stating that like there is no control of like the forces, militias. It's like totally out of the hand of the state, which is what led into like the assassinations like series like that. It's like every once in a while take place, but like unfortunately started again because people were like getting prepared for like the first like annual like time like approaching October, so people started like to move back again because of like what happened with COVID-19 that stopped the movement. People like were like a bit like going back and like giving it a break, but now like there is a preparations. Unfortunately, these preparations, these like movements, these like reminders of like the new government that like took place like currently after the protest, like it's not like all given. We saw like since last week, especially in Basra, it was like the situation is way out of the government's control. Lots of like, let's say militias is like controlling the area, seeing like weapons all over the place. Assassinations happened like by like killing like one of the activists, Tahsin, and like a couple of days ago, the assassination of the activist Riham. All their fault or like their like crime was like just like to be like heard, to ask for basic needs. I mean, like till the moment what we are seeing is like all the needs that we are requesting for. It's not something hard. People are like asking for like an infrastructure. People are asking for like employment, like opportunities for the younger generations. All these like requests were like answered with violence and answered with killing. People are reached a point like being scared because like now like the threats is like all over the place. All the activists try like to keep their life safe, so they are like now even struggling to keep themselves like alive. The situation is like beyond control, is like and we are like waiting to see what is the government, what is the prime minister's like answer to it. What we are requesting for is that like finding justice and real investigation for all these like 700 persons who got killed.
So you do see it in a way, these assassinations, these targeting of activists, you do see it as scaring protesters, and people are looking out for their safety. But still, protests have continued since last year. So how do you explain that?
I think it's like, I mean, since like October, like there was like lots of kidnapping like events, lots of like assassination events. The main idea is that like it's like, as you mentioned, like is to scare the protesters and to keep it down. However, it's like we reached like the bottom. We have like, as everybody mentions, we have nothing to lose. We just like asking for a country. I mean, it's like if there is like what we are like we're requesting for is a country for us. If we are like not having that, that means like there is no point for us to live in Iraq. So that's like the idea is that like what, even with all the violence that is happening, that like that's becoming, and what I see it's through the youth movements, it's just like encourage them to go more and beyond, because like what we see it's like that means like these movements are like finally start to do something, finally started like to make like the politicians and like the governments like at least like to hear like what is going on. Otherwise they will not treat it in the same way. We have been going through like since 2011 like movements in Iraq started and protests, but we have been ignored. But like this time is like that give them the motivation that we are heard. Let's keep going for the sake of the people who lost their lives.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, you know, for Iraqi activists, Iraqi protesters, we have nothing to lose. It's almost you hear the same words coming from Beirut, from protesters downtown, especially in the aftermath of the explosion. These are people who lost their homes, have literally nothing left. Sawsan, to you, can you tell us a little bit, what impact do you see today from the explosion on the over 1 million refugees in Lebanon, and how they are dealing with the aftermath? Are they taking part of, in the protests happening downtown?
Yes, I want to start by saying that absolutely what Noof was mentioning about young people in Iraq has parallels for sure in Lebanon. So a lot of the comments that are coming out, the responses of people is that we have nothing left to lose, or that this political establishment has done everything against us, to the point that some people are saying that they even threw a nuclear bomb on us. I mean, describing the explosion as a nuclear bomb. So absolutely, this sense of there's nothing left to lose, and particularly young men who are unemployed and who don't see a future in the country. In fact, pushing into like the parliament, into other government buildings without fear of being arrested or thrown, having tear gas or rubber bullets thrown at them, literally because they've reached a point where, that's all they have at this point is their bodies. I want to go back and talk about the refugees. So yes, the area where the explosion happened in the port is cosmopolitan, and a lot of refugees, Syrian refugees in particular, and migrant workers live there and work there. The protests following the explosion were a bit different from the protests that took place in October of last year, in that they came at a time where people are really dazed. I went to the first protest that happened after the explosion, and I didn't know people didn't know what to do. They were just standing there, confused and dazed, and not knowing what to chant or what to say. And we're looking at all the destruction around them. So we were demonstrating in an area that had glass all over the ground and destruction. The refugees did not have a presence there. The refugees are victims just as the Lebanese are from the explosion. However, I think this, partly because for Syrian refugees, although there are, significant numbers of refugees who live in urban settings and who live and work in Beirut, most of the refugees live in other regions in Lebanon. And Palestinian refugees, for the most part, the refugee camps and gatherings are a bit slightly away from the port. But it's not really about geography only. I think that just the refugees also didn't know what to do in this situation. In the case of Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian Civil Defense participated in the rescue operations. Palestinians donated blood. Of course, the first few days, everybody was donating blood. Palestinian Syrians from other countries, even people were donating blood. I'm not sure if it reached Lebanon safely. But I want, if you want me to talk about the October 17 revolution and the participation of refugees, or how the issue of refugees came about, or if you want me to wait a little bit.
No, go ahead. So the issue of refugees, and also if you can touch upon, we're also seeing a rise in xenophobia in Lebanon, even as, inclusive protests are taking place downtown. You see former foreign minister, for example, Gibran Bassil, threatening to use the refugees in sending them to Europe or across the Mediterranean. it's also something, you know, that brings memories from the Civil War for those of us who grew up there, that people are being, you know, discriminated against by their accent, by their Lebanese accent. So if somebody from Tripoli comes to a certain area in Beirut, some of them are being targeted. So if you can also touch upon that and the role of the refugees and the protests, that would be great from October till today.
Right. You're absolutely right. I mean, the use of refugees as a scarecrow by populist politicians who basically don't have an answer to, cannot give any reason for their ineptness and corruption. So basically, everything is blamed on the refugees. The electricity is blamed on refugees, the water, the waste, the lack of waste management. The economy. I mean, Lebanon, and as in other Arab countries, does not have any economic plan for employment, youth employment, for example. And then when people go out and complain about not being employed, then, you know, populist politicians say, well, it's the fault of the refugees. They're stealing your jobs. This is typical. It happens everywhere. In Lebanon, it's pretty, it's heightened because I also think that because of the political makeup in Lebanon that's based on confession, that one of the things that Lebanese can hold on to define their identity is basically excluding refugees and immigrants and foreigners in general. That's mainly one of the main things that pulls the Lebanese together, who are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And who sometimes, you know, people from Tripoli and people from the south or Beirut sometimes don't meet. You know, young people in their 20s from Beirut have never met anyone from Tripoli or from Beqa or from the south. So yes, absolutely, the refugees are used as a scarecrow, particularly in the political context of Lebanon. In the October 17th revolution, to some extent, this discourse on the street was muted to some extent, not to a large extent. So whereas in other type of smaller scale demonstrations that happened before October 2019, young Lebanese people would go out and complain that I'm unemployed because the refugees are stealing my job. The government is not controlling Syrian refugees. In the revolution, you basically heard a lot more blaming of politicians. And basically, whereas the street in the past was divided into two main camps, in what I think the politicians were taken aback by in the October 2019 revolution, is that there was one voice that was against all politicians rather than someone from one camp blaming another camp. And you all know about the slogan, the main slogan of the Lebanese revolution of all of them means all of them. And that was very strong at the beginning in the first few days of the protests. What happened also in the protests, now the mainstream of the protests was very, basically had a nationalistic discourse, meaning, you know, people were going out as Lebanese and saying, as Lebanese, we don't want our children to emigrate out. We want to have electricity. We want to have the right to live in this country in dignity. We want our money back, basically. That was the beginning of people's realization that they lost their money in the banks. They couldn't access their money in their bank accounts. So this is not to say that the revolution was full of people who, or activists who held on to universal values of social equity and dignity for everyone in Lebanon, absolutely. Yet the mainstream was mainly nationalistic. At some point, I want to maybe give a chance to Noof to talk a little bit, but at some point, I also want to mention about specific specific groups in the October 2019 revolution, particularly a group of intersectional feminists that really put front and center the rights of refugees, the rights of women, the rights of Lebanese women married to non-Lebanese, and the rights of refugees and migrant workers. This group of women actually pulled this together and presented a really comprehensive agenda for the rights of everyone in Lebanon that is based on equity and justice. So I can mention a few things about them in a little bit.
Excellent. Noof, the same question to you. When you see the integration of the street protests in Iraq, do you see the refugees being or the internally displaced being part of this, and what gaps, if they're not there, why is that? What gaps do you see in the movement about the IDPs and the refugees?
Lots of them were like participating, even though not like in the I'm talking about IDPs because like the majority of like the situation in Iraq is like having IDPs since like the invasion of like ISIS of like third of the country. We had like around like 1.4 million IDPs. Refugees become less and less due to the situation in Iraq, due to the unsafety and security in Iraq. That's why they are like more into like the northern region, like Kurdistan region of Iraq, where we see more like refugees camps. But also like the IDPs are like in lots of areas, which is like one of the triggers actually, because like till the moment, 1.4 like million IDPs are like not able to go home just because like still there is like no place to go to. The government's like promises of like recovery and like for the areas where like damaged, like it wasn't like nothing happens like yet. So it's like we saw like in the past couple of years there was like a push for the sake of the agenda that like the government that put like to close all the IDP camps and put them back like to their areas. However, like nothing happened. So it's like what we saw is that like a massive evictions like that took place like in the camps to return like to force people to return to their villages and their areas. However, like they're returning to nothing. So simply that they are moving distant from the camp to their what used to be their house. We didn't see lots of like improvements in that. We didn't see like lots of like rights. Like simply as like the government were like relying on the UN like agencies, and then like the international NGOs and even the local NGOs to provide like the major like services to them, but like nothing like much from the government side. This is also triggered because like this is a high like number of population. However, like when like there was like movements, we didn't see lots of like movements or protests in the areas where like let's say used to be controlled by ISIS, or like the IDPs were there due to threats like that, like against them. People were like still scared, like threats from militias, from the government itself, from the local governments, from each governorate, that like you are in areas like just like liberated from ISIS, so it's like keep the safety of your cities, like it's put in that way. That's why we saw lots of them like coming towards Baghdad to protest because like they have the right, and like it's part of like the triggers, like they do have needs like and promises by the government that they didn't see. That's why we saw lots of them like coming to Baghdad as like the nearest point, and like the protest movement started like from Baghdad going towards like the south, towards Basra, but like the highest like movements were like, or like the leadership of like the whole protest in all the provinces were like balanced between Baghdad and Nasiriyah or Diqar like province. That's like was like the main like movements, like still the moment there is like nothing but promises. Even with the current like the government's agenda, we didn't see highlights about like the situation of IDPs. Lots of like, let's say, lots of movements with the programs like towards like to respond, like the IDPs are like now moving into like durable solutions and like community cohesion, but because like there is nothing much like to move, so they are trying like to find a solution for them where they are at the moment, instead of like paving like the road for them, let's say, is like to go back to their like homes.
Okay, while I have you, we're starting to getting audience questions to Noof. You mentioned that the protest movement is leaderless. Could you speak more about the implications of this phenomena and the opportunities and challenges of such an approach? And the question is from Abby. So the pros of the leaderless.
Simply is like, because in the past, and especially in 2015, protest, we saw like the leadership or like management that like led into having a political bloc by like the Communist Party, as well as like the Sadrist movement as well. This was like, let's say, the result of that protest, because like they were like the leaders and the management. However, it's like we didn't see any changes after that, even though that they took 50% of like the parliament seats, so we saw nothing. The younger generation felt like their efforts were stolen from them. So that's one of the reasons like this, like in October's like movements, like the decision was like not to have leaders. The second part is also like for safety and security. If you are like putting one leader or a few leaders, they will be targeted. So it's like I still remember like in November, the government asked like for a list of like people like to talk to or to have negotiation with from the protesters. The list were like giving, but like simply the names were like the names of the martyrs who were like killed by the government in the protest and in the squares. Simply is like it's mentioned that like we are led by the people who got killed because we don't want like their blood like to be like wasted. This is like have like some like, let's say, pros and cons as well. As in each movement, it's like not an easy to organize, not an easy to agree on one movement, not an easy thing like to request for. However, we saw that like simply is like what unifies everyone, similar to what's happening in Lebanon, which I think is like, it's like we believe that like these two countries are historically is like tied together in like situations and everything. The main demand was like we want like a new Iraq, and the second one, we don't want like the same one. So it's like it's the same slogan. Everyone means everyone, but with the difference of like the way of saying it or like expressing it. Yeah, and like till the moment, we still see protesters are still in Tahrir Square and other squares. They have their tents. COVID-19 affected like the movement and like how they are like how the number of people are there. But we still see people like that.
Yeah, let's. We have. I have few questions on COVID-19 with the IDPs and the refugees specifically. But to Sawsan, you have a question. How did the Lebanese feel about their Hezbollah and Iran actions in Syria? How these actions were responsible for the Syrian refugee issue in the country? The question is from Jerry.
Yes, I mean, definitely there are people in Lebanon who absolutely refuse or reject Hezbollah and Iran's involvement in Syria and their support of the Syrian regime as well. In terms of blaming or you know, saying that that is what led to the Syrian refugee crisis. Yes, of course, it played an important role. I mean, that was a civil war. So on the one hand, you have ISIS, on the other hand, ISIS and others, Nusra, and on the other hand, you have the militias that are supported by the regime. And the infighting, you know, between these militias led a large number of people to basically flee Sometimes they fled to the closest border they have, whether it's Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon, and sometimes they fled because they had networks or they knew people. So in answer to that question, there are people who in Lebanon who absolutely reject Hezbollah and Iran's involvement in Syria. Now, the link with the refugees, I'm not sure. I mean, people reject this involvement because it's killing Syrian citizens, Syrian civilians.
Not necessarily blame it for the influx of.
I mean, I'm sure. I mean, of course, this is a diverse country. There are there's a diversity of opinions. There are people who are blaming the influx of refugees on Iran and Hezbollah. There are people who are blaming it on ISIS. There are people who are rejecting the presence of refugees, irrespective. You know, they just don't want refugees. But there are also people who are welcoming refugees. And feel that we need to protect people who flee war, and at the same time who are against Hezbollah and Iran and ISIS and all the players in the Syrian crisis.
Okay, Noof, to you, a question on the new Prime Minister Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, who is in DC at the moment. Kaiko is asking that Kadhimi seems to have a good channel with the protesters. Do you see that? And do you see a bigger sense of accountability happening to protect the protesters? Or is it just rhetoric?
By the end of the day, Kadhimi is coming from the same system that the protesters are rejecting. We haven't seen what we are promising for an independent person, persons not affiliated with the parties that are currently running or managing the country. However, we see a bit of changes in terms of being let's say his background is mostly with media, and he is trying to address the youth and he is trying to be a bit smart about how the way he is addressing the protesters. He promised lots of things. We haven't seen anything yet. He promised an investigation for the 700 person who got killed. We haven't seen anything yet. He promised a 3 days investigation after the assassination of Dr. Hisham al-Hashimi. 2 days ago, we there was an event for the 40th day after his death, and nothing yet.
When you say nothing, it means has there no arrests been made? Has there been
nothing yet? What we see is that we will do this and we will do that, and we have been I mean, as an Arab person living in Arab countries, we are all used to the we will and we shall. But nothing yet happened. The only thing that we saw is that there is he set the next date for the next elections, which there is lots of challenges around it yet, to be decided officially yet, after the back and forth that's happening. And we saw some movement, he is trying to address the people by simply for example, now he is pushing to the legislation of the family protection law and the domestic violence protection laws, which created another chaos in the streets as well, between supporters and against.
Okay.
He might be a good person, he might not be, but he is not what we are asking for, simply. And yeah, nothing much to see. I cannot see anything concrete that he promised.
A question to both of you: how is this pandemic hitting the displaced population and the refugee population? They have it harder on when it comes to health access, when it comes to economic disparity. So if you can touch upon that situation, and these people cannot really afford to self-isolate at times. So Sawsan, let's start with you, and then Noof.
Yes. So yes, absolutely. I think it is much more difficult for refugees, who rely on daily wages, who work, who have precarious jobs, and work seasonally and rely on daily wages, to basically be able to isolate and to abide by lockdown guidelines. COVID has had really a devastating impact on Lebanon. A lot of the businesses have closed. It's, even some businesses that you thought wouldn't close because they rely, they're food businesses, but they're closing right now. But particularly they've affected the refugees because they have precarious jobs and rely on basically earning an income without contracts and for short-term work, which they haven't been able to do because of COVID. In terms of the impact in case COVID cases increase, particularly in refugee camps, there are cases absolutely in Burj al-Barajne, there are cases in Beqa, in Syrian settlements, and basically the reaction of the Lebanese government is to isolate the whole camp, which is really very problematic as well. UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and UNRWA, that provides services to Palestinian refugees, have basically a plan, a disaster or a pandemic response plan. I hope that they never need to use it, but if they do, I hope that it works actually. But now also with the explosion and the fact that COVID cases have increased dramatically among the Lebanese population over the past 10 days, 10 days after the explosion, we started to see a dramatic increase in COVID cases. So I think a lot of the resources are going to go into basically a general response to COVID, because also UNHCR is coming forth and saying that they are going to contribute to the COVID response in Lebanon in general, and not only with respect to refugees. But anyways, just to conclude, to say that COVID has had devastating economic impact on Lebanon in general, but particularly among the refugees because of the nature of the employment that they have, and the fact that they are also under the threat of being isolated and blamed for the rise of infection rates as well.
Noof?
In Iraq in general, the Ministry of Health is not able to control the pandemic. We are now seeing the cases in Iraq overall is increasing, while the rest of the world is preparing for the second wave of the pandemic. We're still in the first wave and going up, which leads that there is no control, some specific measures inside the camps. The rely mostly is on the UN agencies and the NGOs who are implementing programming and activities within the camps. The rely is on them more to try to prevent and to provide the support. On general, and also on the other side and on the other hand, not being prepared for the pandemic in general, it's also not only affect people getting infected, but also affecting especially the IDPs' economical situation. People who are relying on a daily basis kind of income, they are now affected, and there is no preparations or some measures provided by the government to provide more support, at least to those to the IDPs.
If I can follow up with you, Kadmi's visit, he was able to actually receive $200 million from USAID. Part of it is going to, or supposed to be going to, help IDPs and refugee population and the impact of COVID-19. How do you think this is best spent, and is this enough money, and what else would you like to see from whether the US or international donors on this?
I mean, if you look at it as like from like the overall picture, Iraq should be like, Iraq is a rich country, should be, right? The issue that we are facing is the corruption. So it's like the money that is handed to the government, we're not sure how much of it is going to reach like the people in need, or like to the reason for it. Or that funding.
You're not sure that this money will actually go to where it's supposed
we
to?
have like a massive corruption issues. So it's like if they hand it like to other like independent persons, like, or like agencies to implement that, we will at least like make sure that it will reach like the people, it reach the IDPs. Going to the government, that means like majority of it's going to their pocket.
You do, if you were, to advise or make a recommendation to US government, you would have rather had that money sent to independent and non-government organizations.
Totally.
Okay, and Sawsan, I think the same applies to Lebanon. Do you feel encouraged that the aid that's being sent after the explosion is not going directly to the government, and instead is going to the UN organizations and other operating on the ground?
Yeah, I was nodding my head when Noof was talking, because it's the same situation in Lebanon. And in fact, it was really a big embarrassment, because the Lebanese people were asking donors not to send anything to the government. The donors and France and other countries were saying, we're not going to give the government anything, we're going to give it to the UN, because of corruption and because
we actually may have lost connection with Sawsan, so we'll wait for her to come back. It could be part of the power cuts that actually happen so often in Beirut. Noof, there is a question to you on what specific actions would you like to see PM Prime Minister Kadhimi take in Iraq to implement the changes that you're talking about, especially since he lacks the political bloc and has no majority in the parliament?
Simply is like Al-Kadhimi's position, he is like a transitional, like, let's say, prime minister. If we go based on the constitution and the situation that happened, the resignation of Abdul Mahdi's government, like last November, he should be only transitioning within like a period of time. So simply what we are like waiting for him is like to do is like simply three things, is that like support like the legislation of the new elections law, setting up the high like committee, independent committee of elections, and setting up like the upcoming elections. This is what he should be doing within like this government. We are not expecting him like to do more, because he should not. We are waiting for like a better like elections that like we are like not like, we will not be able like to see new faces. And what we are requesting for, if we are like staying with the same like legislations and laws. So that's what he should like be pushing for the next elections. If the next elections happens without like these changes, that means like we're still in the same cycle. Nothing will change.
Do you see, another question, do you see any role for the Iraqi diaspora in the protests or in supporting civil society organizations?
I mean, there is like there was like lots of support within the protest, in terms of like, for example, we saw lots of like international NGOs setting up like let's say medical like points like for the injured within like the protest. There was like some push and advocacy for like the UN like head of like representative in Iraq to take an actions like as well, and to like providing support, because it was like at the beginning it was like totally against like what is going on, until like that push we started seeing like some commitments. Now we are seeing like some support in terms of like advocacy work. Now we see lots of focus about like the youth preparation for like, let's say, the preparation for the political leaders in Iraq, like, because like this is what we are hoping for, is that like this protest, like to create a new bloc, like for political blocks, like to compete like in the elections, and we see new faces, like younger like generations and younger faces in Iraq. And I see now Sawsan is back.
Yeah, Sawsan is back thanks to the power of generators in Lebanon. Sawsan, the same question goes to you. What do you assess to be the role of the Lebanese diaspora in the protests and in supporting change in Lebanon?
I think the diaspora has a really important role to play. Because I think after migrating outside Lebanon, they become freer of like less entangled in the local politics and the confessionalism in Lebanon. And I think like lobbying in other countries, one of the things that happened after the Beirut explosion is that activists wanted to lobby or they wanted the diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora, to lobby to the ambassadors to resign, for example. So I think some form of activism. Sorry.
The ambassador to Jordan did resign.
Right. So like making political statements, even if these statements are symbolic, basically. The other thing relates to, the role that the Lebanese diaspora used to play in the past in terms of remittances, because I think one of the problems, I mean, the main problem with the economy is the corruption and the central bank basically being very incompetent in making certain decisions that basically siphoned people's bank accounts. But also what happened was that the Lebanese diaspora also, particularly those who are in the Gulf, could no longer send the remittances that they used to send in the past. Or some of them who continued to have good incomes lost trust in the Lebanese establishment and stopped sending their money back to Lebanon. I'm not saying that the Lebanese diaspora should send money to Lebanon, but I'm just mentioning that this was one of the issues that contributed to the economic collapse as well. But I do think that the Lebanese diaspora can play an important role in defining, basically helping Lebanon move in a certain direction away from the confessionalism and the corrupt political regimes. In fact, the Gibran Bassil, the minister who was Minister of Foreign Affairs for a long time, really wanted to tap into the Lebanese diaspora, but in a way that's, basically he wanted them to invest in Lebanon. He wanted the older immigrants to come back and reclaim their nationality and the Lebanese nationality. I don't think these efforts are going to bear fruit now after everything that's been happening in Lebanon. But I think the Lebanese diaspora can play a role in supporting Lebanon and the changing politics in Lebanon in a completely different way that Gibran Bassil envisioned.
Yeah, and we actually have 1 minute left, so I want you both to offer concluding remarks. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel in this situation? We do have one question though about the blame on the Syrian government in this. Do you see any end or any resolution, settlement to the problem of IDPs and refugees if the conflict in Syria is not settled. So to each of you, if you can, conclude and answer that question, and that will bring us to the end of our event.
Want to go first, Noof?
Or you?
Or
Yeah, sure. So it's like for Iraq in general, even though the situation is still struggling and it's still like tricky if it's like moving in a positive or negative way, what we are coming from like all these movements is that like we have like a really strong like young generation that like we are sure that like they're like now becoming the leaders. Whether like the October like request or like movements created like any kind of results or not, but we're like sure that like in the coming like years we will have a more like a younger generation who is like aiming to rebuild the country. That will also like support into like the current situation of IDPs. These like young leaders like of the future will be supporting in this because we don't have trust in the government. So we are really relying on them, and this is like the gain of Iraq at the moment to see is like the young generation who's so inspiring and moving forward. Thank you.
I have the same answer. I think what is there is light at the end of the tunnel, and I think struggle is cumulative. So even if things are not happening now, they will happen at some point. I think in Lebanon, you can definitely see a generational shift. The young people do not think like their parents and grandparents, and the old guards, the politicians, are losing ground. And to the point that they're coming out and threatening young people with civil war, and young people have a completely different frame of mind. The old political system is rotten, and the young people don't believe in it anymore. It's not easy. It's going to be a struggle, but I think it'll happen. Things in Lebanon cannot continue the way they are. And the good thing about some of the movement that is happening in Lebanon is that it is really holding on to universal values of justice and equity, and including everyone, and is not only bogged down with the nationalist sort of like demands. So I am optimistic about Lebanon, but I think it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, well, on that optimistic note, I want to thank you both for the work that you do, for being with us from, to offer a fresh perspective from Beirut and Baghdad. Thanks, MEI, for hosting this panel, for giving us this very enlightening conversation. I hope next time we meet, it would be, a better conversation on the upward movement of change and reform in both those countries. Thanks to our audience, and have a great weekend. Be safe.
Thank you.